If you're a regular viewer of my videos, particularly my DCAMU retrospective series, there's a phrase you will have heard a lot. In the comics, 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 in the comics! Welcome to In the Comics. This is a new series where I will be looking at movies and TV show episodes that are either based on a specific comic or have taken enough elements from one or more comics to make it worth talking about adaptation-wise. Now, I read and watch a few adaptation critics who naturally focus on books to movies, and I've heard the idea bandied around that with a book change is expected because of the drastic swap in mediums, but with comics, it is one visual medium to another, so it should be fairly similar because you have a ready-made storyboard, right? Oh no. The thing about those who engage in comic book media is we have a strange relationship with change. Anyone who has a concept of how long-running these characters are and how often they've changed hands understands the necessity for change. So adaptation is frequently about trying to find new ways to tell old stories. Not always, but frequently. Take the upcoming The Batman, for example. It's fun for us to theorise and think they're taking elements from Long Halloween and Dark Victory, but we've also got the Riddler. The trailer looks like it has kind of a serial killer vibe to it. Long Halloween was a serial killer mystery. Are they swapping out the villains? That would be interesting. Are the Court of Owls involved? Maybe the Riddler is his own sick, twisted kind of vigilante, and he's trying to expose the corruption of the Court of Owls, making him and Batman two sides of the same coin. Two sides of the same coin! Two-Face was the Long Halloween's villain! And then we have to stop because that rabbit hole is so deep we'd reach Australia before we got to the bottom. So, adapting comic books is frequently about taking what is established and putting a new spin on it and adding new elements along the way. Unlike book lovers who subconsciously want to see what they've imagined in their heads on screen, comic book lovers would probably look at a faithful adaptation and say, I've read the comic. I know the characters. I know the story. Give me something new. So in that sense, we are simultaneously more conditioned to expect change and also less willing to accept it sometimes, because there are elements of fans' headcanons that, if messed with, can seriously ruin an adaptation for them. Still working on that no killing rule essay? So, what this series is for is to look at the very unique, fluid and often contentious subject of adapting comic books. To anyone who's worried about my DCAMU series, don't worry, that's still my priority. I just thought that City of Demons was a good segue into this topic. So to start us off, City of Demons the movie is not based on City of Demons the comic. They have nothing to do with each other. Instead, City of Demons is based on another Constantine comic called All His Engines. To address the first change, I think they probably just thought that City of Demons as a title had more punch to it. Kind of like how the Young Justice TV series has nothing to do with the Young Justice comic. They just thought the title sounded cool. The next major difference is the age of the characters. In All His Engines, John is in his 50s. Because he is one of the very few comic book characters that actually ages. Unless we're talking about New 52 Constantine, who, like everyone else, is perpetually in his 30s. Both stories roughly begin with John's friend Chaz coming to him for help because a loved one has fallen into a coma. But due to the age differences, the movie decided to make Trish Chaz's daughter.
You have a kid.
Whereas in All His Engines, she was his granddaughter. Which, I don't know why they did that, because Chaz actually has a daughter, Geraldine, so I don't know why they didn't just use Geraldine here. I guess they thought that in the 21st century, no parent would be cruel enough to name their child Geraldine. One thing that hasn't changed is John's relationship with Chaz's wife Renee, who hates him. Now, I love John, but I don't blame her. This should be any sane person's reaction when they see John Constantine. No. Comic John goes to a medium to find out what's going on, whereas in the movie, the medium comes to him. This allows for the inclusion of Justice League Dark characters like the Nightmare Nurse, who is delightful.
Timing sucks, Johnny. I was right in the middle of a threesome with a dryad and a sylph, both of whom, I might add, are better in the sack than you ever were.
From this point, the main stories play out pretty much the same. We get a brief flashback of John and Chaz's friendship, This happens much later in the movie and is explained to the nightmare nurse by Renee. Keep that tucked away in your head because we'll be circling back to it. Chaz and John travel to LA where many similar coma cases are cropping up, and they visit the address they were given to by the medium, and they encounter this monstrosity, who turns out to be a bit of an entrepreneur as he wants to create a branch office of hell where he makes deals with people in exchange for fulfilling their dreams. Sounds like LA to me. But like any new business venture, it naturally attracts competition. Quick note, while the movie made its own torture room, which is horrendously creative, I like that the torture room from the comic appears as a painting on the wall of the house. That was a nice little Easter egg. And the demon Beyrul uses Trish's soul as leverage to conscript John to getting rid of them for him. I think Comic John puts it the most eloquently. We're being buggered over a barrel, mate. All we can do is spread wide and think of England. Now, this is where the comic branches off a bit. Both Johns do some research and come across the Aztec god Mictlantecutli, who from this point forward I will be referring to as Mick, who they rope in to help take care of Beyrul's competitors. There's more to this in the comic, but again, let's put a pin in that. Of course, Beyrul rescinds on the deal and keeps Trish's soul in order to force John to do more work for him. John, depressed by the failure, goes out and gets drunk before pulling himself together, cutting off Beyrul from the souls he's sucking, killing him and getting Trish back. I originally thought these two were fairly similar, and in a way they are, but there are a lot of differences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say what I think they did better in the movie, what I think they did better in the comics, and what I think they did differently that just worked best for their respective stories, and also try to theorize as to why these differences exist. So let's start with the movie. John's trauma is given much more weight here, which I always appreciate. But at the same time, the movie is John's story, whereas the comic is Chaz's story, which we'll get to. Mick in the comic confused me a bit. I've read through this a few times and I don't get why this god was kicking around in John's head before everything all started. Maybe I'm missing something, maybe I'm reading it wrong, but the comics actually start with a flashback where John is visited by this god. And later, after Trish falls into a coma, he has a vision of him again. And I thought this was a very confusing addition. What is John's connection to this Aztec god? Whereas in the movie, he's really just a weapon John uses to take out his enemies, which is very in keeping for that character. Another thing the movie was really good at was showing how knowledge of magic and the supernatural separates you from the rest of humanity. It also brings up a lot of interesting questions about love, which I will get to in the neutral section. For now, let's move on to what they did better in the comic. Needless to say, there is no Angela, i.e. the embodiment of the city of Los Angeles in the comics, because she was such a superfluous addition that you could remove her entirely from City of Demons and nothing would be affected. Except, of course, we would be deprived of that delightful scene where she gives John a history lesson about LA, which for some reason takes the form of her shape-shifting mid-thrust during sex, which, I don't kink shame. Really, the only thing that truly annoyed me about the movie was their treatment of Chaz. Now, Chaz is a big part of John's life, and he's very loyal to John, and that's pretty much the only thing they got right. Chaz is John's polar opposite, not only in temperament, but also physically. They're very much a brains and brawn duo. Chaz is very much a gentle giant, but is also willing to throw a punch when he needs to. And though he is a very patient person, which you kind of have to be if you're friends with John, boy does he have a temper when he's pushed to his limits. He is not a very deep character, but that's kind of the point of him. He is a rock. He is also willing to take John to task, though he doesn't do it nearly as much as he should. He does give John more credit than most people would, but he doesn't follow him mindlessly. This comic probably gives us Chaz's only character arc. He and John visit the people who still worship Mick, and he meets a girl he likes, cheats on his wife with her, and he is the one who considers giving up. His state of mind about his rocky marriage is very relatable. in the sense that he feels like he just keeps going on for the sake of keeping going on. And he thinks that considering he has this new and exciting relationship, maybe that happiness is going to remain if he stays with her. But after John telling him he's a twat and his own conscience kicking him up the backside, he decides he just can't be that man. As opposed to movie Chaz, who is significantly less impressive. He's not physically imposing. He doesn't seem to have any flaws that aren't connected to his love for John. He doesn't blame John for anything that is actually his fault. And most importantly, he doesn't do anything. I get that John had to be the centre focus of the movie, but you couldn't have done anything with this character, especially since he is meant to be the emotional core of the movie. You really had to take away all his agency, as well as his key character trait of being the brawn to John's brain, and just turn him into John's cheerleader.
Even if we can save Trish, we will. You will.
They really didn't know what to do with this character, so much so that they just got rid of him. For now, let's move on to the neutral section. Now, like I said, City of Demons is John's movie, so it will naturally focus on his struggle more. And since this can serve as a jumping on point for new fans, that means a focus on Newcastle. Now, the Newcastle incident was one of John's early failures and is considered by many to be his origin story, which I don't quite agree with, but that's another topic. He and his occult friends tried to save an abused girl named Astra, who summoned a demon to deal with her abusers and won't go away afterwards. John decides to summon a bigger demon named Nergal to take care of it, and it does, but it also drags little Astra to hell. John, depending on the interpretation, is either committed or commits himself to Ravenscar Psychiatric Hospital. This is not in all his engines. It was in an earlier Hellblazer arc called The Devil You Know. It plays out pretty similar in the movie, except in the comic Chaz wasn't there. Because he and John weren't childhood friends, John met Chaz after he moved to London and they became roommates. I get this change because they wanted a deeper connection to John's innocence, and they wanted John to lose the last person alive who knew the pain of Newcastle. This is all fine, except that despite this Chaz apparently having grown up in Liverpool, they still decided to give him a London accent.
Open the bloody door, John!
My daughter. It's my natural charm. You can't resist it.
Anyway, back to Newcastle, because another thing they decided to do was leave out the part about Astra summoning her own demon, which serves to make John even more responsible.
He could have just called the cops.
Yeah. Why didn't he just call the police? He couldn't in the comic because there was a demon running around. What the hell are the police gonna do? The summoning of his own demon was meant to exemplify his arrogance, that he thought he was able to control that kind of power, and ended up making a bad situation worse as a result. But while John may be arrogant, he's not stupid, and he's certainly not someone to do something the hard way when an easy solution is right there. If John could have called the police, he would have. But in the movie, it was just Astra's abusive father. So, what the hell, movie John? They also left out the fact that all of this took place in the middle of a magical orgy.
Magical convocations.
Which, you know, I get that. Even if you weren't concerned about the rating you were going to get, I get that. Now, because of the shift in focus, one big change is the identity of Beirul. He really is just a crafty, ambitious, bottom-feeding demon in all his engines. Whereas in the movie, he is Nergal in disguise. This is a pretty good change for the story they were telling. This also changes the way they defeat him. In all his engines, Constantine does what he does best. Cons people. He makes a deal with Mick, who was left to die in the movie after his purpose was fulfilled, to kill Beirul and knit Trish's soul back together with her body. But he wouldn't surrender Trish, so John threatens to kill her using a fetish, taking Mick with her. It works because John is the world's greatest bullshitter, and Chaz, after bidding his affair farewell, takes Trish home to Geraldine and Renee. In the movie, John uses the power of love. Now, this is far less corny than it initially sounds. Constantine and all his comics have always been steeped in occultist imagery and practice.
He's one of the characters in literature and certainly in comic books who is actually closest to what the occult really is.
And this is no surprise considering one of his creators, Alan Moore, is a witch himself. Now, when I say witch, I don't mean Harry Potter or Lord of the Rings style witch or wizard. No, I mean by that just a practitioner of old Wicca/occult traditions. Modern practice of ancient magical rituals is all about cultivating the power of intention.
You condense a desire into a symbol that you then forget what the original desire was.
Myths, traditions, and symbolisms in the occult are what gives Hellblazer its unique atmosphere. The idea of a world just beyond your comprehension. And it's always used powerful emotions like guilt, anger, grief, and love, charged by the power of intention to create spells.
If it wasn't for those women bringing that pain into your house, then...
Midnight didn't raise those spirits, not really. You three did. Guilt is a very powerful emotion.
And if you don't know a lot about these rituals that permeate all modern religions, particularly Catholicism, then the idea of using the power of love does come across as kind of corny, but it is very in keeping with occultist practice and what John's magic is actually capable of. But in the end,
there's always a price to pay, Chaz.
John sacrificed Trish and Renee's love for Chaz as well as Chaz's love for him, which means they are both now alone. And considering how bleak the Hellblazer comics are, adaptations usually try and soften the stories at least a little bit, so it's really something for the comic to end on a happier note. So, conclusion. The comic is better. Shocking coming from me, I know. But as long as an adaptation doesn't take away from the source material, or if it does, replaces it with something that was worth the switch, I can appreciate them for what they are. Did City of Demons do that? Yes. It left out quite a bit, but the comic kind of went on the assumption that you already knew who John was. Whereas the movie is actually a pretty good jumping on point if you're interested in getting to know the character but don't really know where to start. You should start with Dangerous Habits though, just saying. The only thing I found disappointing was Chaz. Both his characterization and his ending. His love and memories of John are gone, so we are never going to see him again. In Hellblazer, Chaz is one of the very few people who have actually managed to maintain a relationship with John without meeting a terrible end for it. Whether that be just down to dumb luck or John deliberately keeping his distance as much as possible, I don't know. But Chaz is kind of like Alfred in Batman in the sense that the active part he plays in John's stories is usually fairly minimal, but he is always there. He is a touchstone for the character to go back to. And if the CW make more of these movies, it is kind of sad to think that he's not going to be there. For how bleak the Constantine comics can get, they're never really nihilistic. There's always a hopeful edge to them. Getting rid of Chaz before we even get the chance to truly know him beyond husband, father, and friend is disappointingly wasteful. So with all that in mind, I'm rating the comic an 8.5 out of 10 and the movie a 7.5 out of 10. The next video is going to be the Judas Contract, which is just going to be a straightforward New 52 retrospective review, but if you would like to see an In the Comics episode of the Judas Contract, please let me know in the comments below and I'll put it on the list. I'm also preparing to make a Halloween video, and there's a vote on my Patreon right now. If you become a Winter Soldier tier or above, you can choose between a cheeky look at the film Monster House and the adult things in it you may have missed, a straightforward review of The Long Halloween, which could be quite interesting considering the upcoming The Batman, a look at the cultural impact of Hocus Pocus, because what is Halloween without Hocus Pocus? and my Patreon suggestion option, which is an overview of the occult in DC Comics, which I've decided to call The Devil is in the DC. Because you would be surprised at which DC writers are involved in the occult and how that affects the comics DC produces. So everyone, please consider voting. Thank you for joining me, and once again, bollocks to this version of Chaz. Still not as bad as this one, though.